All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am Steve Cook. I'll introduce myself a little more thoroughly here in a second. We're here to talk about CWU bilateral exchanges and some of our select direct enroll partnerships. So, as I said, I'm going to introduce myself. Again, I'm Steve Cook. My title is the Associate Director of Education Abroad, but I'm also the exchange coordinator. So I'm basically in charge of these programs. Work with both the students going out and the students going in. You can always contact me by email, which is right there. And then I'm always happy to meet with students. And the easiest way to do that is to go ahead and schedule an appointment on our website, which that is our general website address, and then you can find the schedule appointment area. All right, so we're going to start off with a little bit of vocabulary. So the difference between an exchange and direct enroll. So exchanges are generally two-way relationships between CWU in this case and our partner institutions, meaning that we will send a student, they will send a student in return. And students pay tuition and fees to the home university, which essentially pays for the student coming from the partner institution. So you won't have to pay two sets of tuition. You'll pay the tuition and fees here, or as I'll explain later, it's more of a program fee that's based on that. And then the student at the partner institution will pay their tuition fees, which is basically saving your spot. And then it will be waived. You won't have to pay tuition fees at the host institution. Direct enroll, on the other hand, is basically a one-way relationship. You are directly enrolling in the partner. They're abroad, they are not sending students back to us. And then you will pay tuition fees. It says to home university. I was typing too quickly this morning, and that should say host university or host institution. So you're not paying CW tuition and fees. You're paying whatever tuition and fees the host institution sets up for the program. And that's going to vary by host and often by country as well. But where they're similar, both are an opportunity to be immersed in the host institution and culture. And also credit from both is going to be treated as transfer credit. So it's not going to be treated, neither one of them are going to be treated as direct CWU credit. Some other institutions treat exchanges as direct credit, as if students were taking classes at the home university. CWU does not do that. So they will not appear on the CWU transcript. When after it's come back, that'll be in the transfer credit report area of my CWU. All right. Some exchange basics. So as I said, the cost of attendance can be similar to CWU. It's not necessarily going to be exact. So as I mentioned, students pay a program fee to CWU. They're based on the current tuition and fees at the time when they are abroad. But as I'll mention here in a moment, all of our partners are on semester systems. So to keep the math easy and to keep things fair for students, the program fee is based on 1.5 quarters of CWU tuition and fees. And then housing and meals, are all paid locally. Spaces are generally limited according to the agreement between the two institutions. And generally that's the equivalent of 1 to 2 full year placements per academic year. So as if we were going to send a student to one of our partners for 2 semesters, that would be considered 1 full year placement. Whereas if we sent 2 students for 1 semester each, that would also be a 1 full year placement. So the math kind of depends on what students are interested in as far as duration, and then also what the agreement says. So as I said a moment ago, all exchange partners are on semester systems. Most of the rest of the world is on the semester systems rather than quarters. So how a semester fits with CWU quarters depends on when and where student wants to go. generally speaking, in some cases, one semester, you would be gone for only one CWU quarter. So in that case, getting back to the program fee, the program fee would be a little bit higher than tuition and fees were you to stay at CWU. On the other hand, some semesters are going to overlap 2 CWU quarters. And therefore that program fee is a little less than students would pay for the similar time abroad or here at CWU, excuse me. And then of course, if you're there for 2 semesters, then it's a wash. It's going to be the same as if you were here for the full academic year. Eligibility requirements do vary by program. So for example, our Japanese and French partners do have minimum language requirements. And I'll talk more about those once we get to their profiles. Minimum GPA is usually between 2.5 and 2.75, and we can be flexible depending on what's going on. We do require, and this is the CWU requirement, that students have sophomore status at the time of participation. So freshmen now can apply to be going next academic year because they will be sophomores next academic year. Okay. In each case, there is going to be a 2-stage application process. So one for CWU and one for the partner institution. Technically, the partner institution does have the final say in whether or not a student can come, but most of the responsibility for vetting the students is on me as the CWU exchange coordinator, excuse me. So if I've done my job, there shouldn't be too many problems with the host institution application. It's more of a formality to get the student into the system so they can register and have student status, etc. Our CWU applications are all web-based, and they're at that address, cwu.edu/EA/apply. And you can log in with your CWU credentials. The first time you log in, you'll be asked to answer a few questions, confirming a few pieces of information, and then the next time you log in, you won't have to do that again. It'll just take you right to the dashboard. That also includes more information about our exchange partners, as well as links to websites for classes, for accommodation, things of that nature. All right, so moving on to talk about the partnerships themselves. So we're going to start off in Australia. I'm going by alphabetically by country. So we have 2 partners in Australia. Our exchange partner is in Brisbane, which is over on the East Coast, as you can see. And then we have a direct enroll relationship in Perth over on the West Coast. Our exchange partner is Queensland University of Technology, which, as I said, is in Brisbane. Students can go for 1 semester, a US academic year, or an Australian academic year. So the US academic year and the Australian academic year are not the same. Australia follows what's known as the Southern Hemisphere calendar. So their academic year generally follows the calendar year. So semester 1 will start late February and run through about late June, early July. Semester 2 will start late July and run through about mid-November. So that can give you an idea how those semesters would interact with the CW calendar as well. QUT, as it is colloquially known, does have an AACSB accredited School of Business, which is important for students here studying business because our College of Business almost won't transfer in upper divisions of 300 and 400 level classes from another institution unless that institution is AACSB accredited or has one or two other accreditations. They do have a strong STEM program, or a series of STEM programs, including things like health sciences, exercise science, psychology, and then they also have very strong journalism programs, including broadcast journalism. They do have education as well at one of their campuses. One thing education students will want to do is talk to their academic advisors in CWU School of Education to figure out what they can and cannot take abroad. So there might be certain areas that could come in as electives. So they do things like literature and Australian history, things like that are housed within their education program. So those could be things that students might be able to take as an elective within CWU School of Education teacher prep programs without having to worry about actual state certification requirements. Because when you're getting into theory and things of that nature, education law, it becomes very location specific in a lot of ways. So it can be more challenging. The types of accommodation that are available at QUT, one are student residences. And these aren't dorms necessarily in the way that we would think of them, because they're not owned and operated by the university. They are basically private organizations that are affiliated or contract with all of the institutions that are in the city. And there's about 3 or 4 institutions of higher education within Brisbane. You could be living with people from QUT as well as the University of Queensland, as well as Griffith University, and I forget the name of the art school there. So it can be very mixed. There are going to be very suite based, or they are suite based, so that you will have anywhere from about 3 to 6 suite mates. You can have it so that you can have your own bedroom with ensuite shower facilities and toilet facilities, or you can share that sleeping quarters with one other person in addition to the larger suite, or within the larger suite. And then there'll be common areas like a living room essentially, and kitchen facilities to prepare your own meals. There won't be a meal plan in the way that CWU students might think of it. It's all what the Australians and Brits call self-catering. So you're preparing your meals, although there are dining facilities on campus, it's just a la carte. Another option as far as accommodation is private accommodation, so private house, private apartment, and QUT can provide some assistance in securing these, and these can be potentially more expensive than student residences, but they are an option. We have had students who've studied at QUT, particularly for 2 semesters, who opted for something along those lines, sharing, and particularly in the case I'm thinking of, sharing a house with other students, including Australian students. And then lastly, the other accommodation option at QUT is a homestay, so living with a local family, which is unusual in Australian institutions. I'm not aware of too many that have a homestay option. Most of our students who have studied at QUT have opted for the student residence, but obviously not all of them. Our other partner in Australia is Curtin University, completely on the other side of the country in Perth. And this is a direct enroll, so it's not an exchange. You're paying tuition and fees at Curtin, but by the nature of the agreements, CWU students do get somewhat of a discount that makes it more cost effective than any of the third-party Australian programs that we work with. Not as cost effective as the exchange, but somewhere between the exchange and other third-party sponsored programs. Like QUT, semester, US academic year, Australian academic year are all options. Their academic year follows the same basic pattern as QUT. They are also AACSB accredited for their school of business, which is good. They also have very strong STEM and a variety of definition and journalism programs. They also have some very excellent service learning opportunities and go out into the community and then to indigenous communities not too far away as well. Their accommodation options are student residences, private accommodation. Some of their student residences are more like our dorms in that they are more closely affiliated with the university, at least. So we have not yet sent a student to Curtin, so I have visited the campus, but we haven't had a student go through it. So I can't speak from that experience. Moving on, our next partner is in France, which is in Orléans specific, which you can see here. And it's only about an hour roughly by train from Paris. And that partner is the University of Orléans. I'm not going to try to pronounce the French because I would butcher it. As I said, it is in the city of Orléans, and this is an exchange partner. For the exchange, students can go for a semester or academic year. And the French semester or French academic year does roughly conform to the CWU or US academic year in terms of structure and rough deadlines or dates, excuse me. Particularly if you're going through the French language institute or the Institut de Français. If you're going through regular classes, then it can be tricky because the French calendar for fall semester does tend to bleed over into what would be our winter quarter. The exams would end in January. As I mentioned earlier, this one does have a minimum language proficiency. So for regular classes, which are very STEM focused, the minimum language proficiency is the equivalent of a B2 on the Common European Framework. There are STEM-oriented classes that are taught in English, but they are graduate level. Most of our students go to study the French language at the Institut de Français, and their minimum language proficiency depends on when one starts. Starting in the fall, it's A1, which is pretty basic. It's not no French, but that's the first level of the European Common Framework. And then if you're starting in the spring, then it's A2, which is the next level. At the moment, because of COVID, they have suspended this so that A2 is not required for spring, but I would expect it to come back at some point for future academic years. Their accommodation options are, again, student residences, private accommodation, and homestay. Move forward. That's the only partner we have in France. So our next 4 are in Japan, 3 of which are in the greater Tokyo area, and then 1 in Kyoto. So Asia University is in Musashino, Tokyo, which is about 2 stops away from the Shinjuku district. Again, it is an exchange. It is primarily exclusively really for students who want to study Japanese language. And because of the structure of that program, students, whether they go for 1 semester or for 2, they have to start in April, which is the beginning of the Japanese academic year. Japanese academic year starts April 1st. First semester will end late July. There'll be a break. The second semester will start up in September, and then end classes for that second semester, will end in January, although officially the semester goes until March, really. But students don't have to stay that long. The minimum proficiency level is fairly high, which is a level 4 on the JLPT test of Japanese language proficiency. And their accommodations options are student residence or private accommodation. The next partner in Japan is Tokyo Gakugei University, which is an education-based, it's a teacher training school, really. And they're in the Kogane area of Tokyo. Again, it's exchange. Unlike Asian university, students can go for one semester at any point in the academic year. They can go for a US academic year, or they can go for a Japanese academic year. There are two tracks. One is what they call ISEP. I believe International Student Exchange Program is still their term, not to be confused with the provider organization ISEP that we work with. And this includes both English taught classes and a research project. And the research project is required as part of the program. And students who want to start this or want to take part in this have to start in the fall. Whether they do one semester or two, they only do intake for ISEP start in the fall. And then the next one is the general track, which Japanese language, content classes in Japanese, and ISEP classes all can go into students. Schedule to, again, their minimum proficiency is the JLPT level 4. Technically for ISEP, there is no minimum language requirement, but for CWU students, particularly if they're going for more than one quarter, there will not be enough credits of the English conducted classes alone to satisfy requirements for like financial aid, or even technically being full-time in terms of just progress towards graduation, which means you have to supplement with Japanese taught classes, which then would require, the Japanese level, the minimum proficiency level. So it can be a little bit challenging. Similarly, their accommodations are student residence and private accommodation. We have not yet set a student there because of the pandemic. We concluded the agreement right before the pandemic started. So our first student on this is set to go this coming April. The next partner, also in the greater Tokyo area, is Takushoku University, which is in the Tokyo area, but it's in Hachioji, which is about 90 minutes by train from the city center. So it's kind of in a more rural area. They really do, their basically preference is the US academic year. So students coming for 2 semesters as a default. This again is really for students of Japanese. So the classes are some Japanese language classes, Japanese as a second language classes, but then content classes that are taught in Japanese. So it does require a high level of Japanese language proficiency and includes a fairly steep learning curve. So the minimum proficiency level is equivalent to the 100 on the JCAT, which is an alternate Japanese language proficiency test. And the accommodation here is a student residence or private accommodation. Most of the students who have gone to any of our Japanese partners have opted for the student residences. And our final partner in Japan is Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, which, as the name would imply, is in Kyoto, the old capital before Tokyo, before Edo, which became Tokyo. Students can do either semester, US academic year, or the Japanese academic year here. They also have 2 tracks. One they call the Japanese course, which is what would be for students who want to study the Japanese language. And then they have the English course, which consists of English taught classes from their global studies program and what they call their Japanology. So Japanese studies, essentially. In terms of language proficiency for the English class, there's no minimum Japanese language proficiency. Students aren't expected to know any Japanese to participate. That is not an appropriate track for students who want to study Japanese language. They will not. There's not an option to do that, really. The Japanese course, the minimum Japanese requirements are fairly basic. It's a minimum of 500 hours, I believe, of study of Japanese language and some familiarity with katakana and hiragana. And that can just be verified by a letter from a Japanese professor, Japanese language professor. In the Japanese course, the levels of Japanese classes are much more nuanced and varied than at any of our other Japanese partners. So students with a lower level of Japanese will be just fine at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. Again, students can opt for a student residence, which most of our students have, or they can opt for private accommodation. Moving on, our next two partners are both in South Korea and both specifically in Seoul. We have Kookmin University, which is up here in the northern part of the city, abutting this national park. In fact, part of the campus is in the national park. And then Ewha Women's University down here in the kind of western central area of the city. I'm going to start with Ewha Women's University. Again, it's in Seoul. You can do either semester, a US academic year or Korean academic year. Korean academic year, like in Japan or Australia, generally follows the calendar year. So the first semester will start in early March and run until about June. And then there'll be a break. The second semester of the academic year will start in September and run through December. They do also have a summer program, but it's not really part of the exchange. The students can do that as a direct enroll option. Even though the university itself is women, so all the Korean students will be women, the exchange is co-ed, so both men and women. Whether cisgender, transgender, or none of the above can participate. It also has an AACSB accredited School of Business, which is important for our College of Business students. It does have a very large selection of English taught classes in a variety of disciplines. And then it also has Korean language and culture. Again, accommodation options are student residence, a dorm, an international dorm, and then private accommodation. Again, not all of our students who have participated have opted for the student residence. Secondly, as I mentioned before, our other partner is Kookmin University. Similar options as far as study duration, semester, US academic year, Korean academic year. They also do have a summer program focused on Korean language and culture, which mostly will be direct enroll, although potentially as part of the exchange. Their English taught classes are a little bit more limited in scope. They're all the most reliable of them are going to be, or most predictable of them are going to be within their College of General Education, which also houses their Korean language and culture classes. There are going to be classes in other disciplines that will be taught in English or another language other than Korean. However, those can revert to being Korean taught without warning at the beginning of a semester if there's not demand for it to continue in English. So students are best, it's more reliable for students to focus on classes in the College of General Education. They do have a business school, however, it is not AACSB accredited, so that's not going to be a good option for students from the College of Business who want to take business classes. And then again, as with the others, student residence and private accommodation are the two accommodation options. We're going to move on to Spain, and this is another direct enroll partner in Leon up here in northern Spain. So we have a partnership with the Center for Languages of the University of Leon. This is a direct enroll opportunity, although we do have it set up so that the partner will bill CWU directly, and then we will bill the student and pay the tuition. And if it's a homestay, housing costs on the student's behalf. So they are much more flexible. They have quarters, basically the equivalent of our quarters. Their terms within the academic year, unlike the main part of the university, are going to be very similar to our quarters. Students can also go for an academic year or for a summer. They have multiple 4-week summer programs, 2 of which do not conflict with CWU terms, and you can either do one or you can combine both of them into a longer 8-week program. This is intensive Spanish language, so anywhere from A1, which again is not absolute beginner, to C1, which is just below kind of native proficiency. Very nearing at A1. The academic program includes not only the language classes, but then local excursions both within Leon itself, and then in kind of the broader province or nearby area. So some of these examples are, tour of the 13th century cathedral there and its beautiful rose window, tour of the 11th century basilica and the royal tombs that are there, with some beautiful frescoes in the ceiling, including a interesting kind of seasonal calendar for each 12 months. That 11th century basilica also has 2 places in it where it incorporates Moorish architectural elements. Other excursions that would be included in the tuition and fees for this program would be going to the neighboring city of Astorga and going to a chocolate museum. They do offer overnight excursions farther afield that are optional extras and therefore an additional cost. So some examples of these are going to Galicia and Santiago de Compostela to see kind of the end of the Community of Santiago. And Leon itself does sit on that path, the path of the Community of Santiago, and is part of the culture of the city. One of the other overnight excursion options historically has been to San Sebastian in the Basque Country as well. They also have a variety of accommodation options, student residences, private accommodation, homestay. It's very common in the Spanish-speaking world for homestays to be part. It gives an option for, or it helps provide an opportunity for students to get a language and cultural immersion. You're getting to see how at least that one family lives. You'll have opportunity to practice Spanish. And for homestays, your meals will be included in that, or mostly included in that. So you'll be eating how they eat, essentially. Okay, so and last but not least, our last 2 partners are in the UK and specifically Scotland. So we have Edinburgh Napier in the capital city of Edinburgh, and then also the University of Dundee up in Dundee, which is about an hour by train from Edinburgh. Start off, Edinburgh Napier University, like I said, is in Edinburgh. Students can do a semester or academic year, although particularly if they're getting certain types of aid like the Pell Grant or the Washington State Need Grant or whatever it's called now. Spring semester only is not necessarily an advised option. Both partners in the UK limit the number of credits that students can register for in a semester at the equivalent of, or at 60 British credits, which is the equivalent of 22.5 CWU credits. So for when it comes to the spring semester, where you would be gone for both winter and spring quarters, in order to meet full-time enrollment, particularly for those types of financial aid, it would be structurally impossible. You would need to have a minimum of 24 credits, the equivalent of CWU 24 credits for the full semester, and that's just structurally impossible. So for like Pell Grant, it would prorate based on that, so you'd actually get less aid. And then kind of even without that, conceptually, you're at least a credit and a half behind in terms of moving yourself forward towards graduation. Some students don't mind that if they don't have to worry about the financial aid issue, but it's something to talk about. Edinburgh Napier does have 3 campuses across the city, and different departments are exclusively based at a specific campus. So this makes taking classes in multiple disciplines difficult. So if you really want to kind of explore different disciplines, history, science, things like that, it's not going to be the best option for you. It does have a very strong, excellent music program. It's also strong in exercise science and psychology. It also has a business school but it is not AACSB accredited. The accommodation is student residences and private accommodation. I would strongly recommend students aim for the student residences, even though Edinburgh won't absolutely guarantee a placement. It's still going to be easier to try to get in and ultimately less expensive than trying to get private accommodation in a city like Edinburgh, which again is the capital of Scotland. So there is usually much more demand than there is supply for housing. And then our last partner is the University of Dundee, again in Dundee, Scotland, about an hour away from Edinburgh by train. As with Edinburgh Napier, semester or academic year, both options, but with a caveat about spring semester as well. This one has a single kind of united campus. So there is a broad range of subjects that are available. There are some that are closed to exchange students, but there still leaves a lot of different options. And because it's a kind of a single campus, it's easier to kind of mix and match. Again, same accommodation options, student residence, private accommodation. I would use the same caution with private accommodation, although it's not going to be as much of an issue in Dundee as it would be in Edinburgh. I have seen the student residences in Dundee, and the ones that I've seen are nice. I haven't seen all of them. I've seen one or two of them, and they're nice. They're, again, the suite structure, so you're going to have your own room with some common areas and suite mates anywhere from 3 to 6, and those common areas will include a kitchen to prepare food for yourself. And with that, we'll end there and then turn it over for questions. We only have one participant, but I will remind you that this is being recorded with the intention of posting it later. So if you feel comfortable with that and want to ask a question, please feel free. If you want to chat, I can go ahead and just end the session in the recording now as well. So whatever you're more comfortable with.
I'm fine with ending it and then having a conversation.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do that. All right, so just to wrap it up for the people who may be listening to the recording, again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address again is steven.cook@cwu.edu, and you're more than welcome to schedule an appointment with me by going to cwu.edu/education abroad, all one word. And then if you look for contact our office, you'll find a link to schedule an appointment. All right, thank you for watching.